Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Casey Keene. I am the Director of Capacity Building and Education here at the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Thank you for joining us for this webinar entitled Allies in the Struggle, Intersectional Work as Trauma-Informed Response and Prevention. This session is the third event in our series of DVAM events hosted by the NRCDV, exploring the intersectionality of oppressions and the importance of fostering partnerships across sectors and between allied social justice movements. For more information about Awareness plus Action equals Social Change campaigns and events, please visit nrcdv.org/DVAM. This webinar is for aspiring white allies interested in deepening our understanding of the connections between racial justice work and domestic and sexual violence intervention and prevention work. Today we'll hear from Kate McCord, Communications Director at the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. She'll explore how disparities created by institutional and systemic expressions of racism may affect survivors of color, why an intersectional approach is integral to a trauma-informed response, and building trauma-informed prevention programs, and share specific examples of how the Virginia Alliance has integrated a racial justice lens into various aspects of their work. We have invited and encouraged people of color to participate in today's session. I'd like to note that this webinar will discuss trauma caused by institutionalized racism, so please practice self-care if you find the material triggering. So before I introduce Kate, I'd like to start by posing a polling question. So let me see if I can pop this up for you. So you should see the question coming up onto your screen. It's, where is your agency or organization when it comes to embracing a racial justice framework? So you'll see the options listed there. We encourage you to click on the response that sounds best for you. Either this is not a conversation we're having, or we explore intersectionality but do not specifically name racism or white privilege. Our organization regularly discusses racial justice. Maybe you're in the place where you've incorporated racial justice language into your mission, vision, purpose, strategic plan, policy priorities, or other documents. Or perhaps you would say that racial justice is a part of your everyday work and that you actively engage with community partners around this issue. I see that many of you have responded already. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. It really looks like participants are spread across the board when it comes to kind of where you are in terms of embracing a racial justice framework. So it's interesting to see that most of you identify somewhere in the middle when it comes to where you are in the process. Thank you so much for participating in that question. It really will help Kate to tailor her presentation to best meet your needs. I'm going to go ahead and close that tab. Now I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Kate McCord has been active in the anti-violence movement since interning at a domestic violence shelter in college. Over the past 25 years, she has worked as a volunteer and later staff at a community-based dual sexual and domestic violence agency, helped establish and lead the Virginia statewide Domestic Violence Training Institute, coordinated the launch of Virginia's statewide sexual assault hotline, and developed numerous public awareness initiatives, including The Art of Surviving, a traveling exhibition of artwork and poetry created by survivors of sexual violence. In her current role at the Alliance, Kate coordinates the Red Flag campaign, which many of you may be familiar with, develops statewide primary prevention initiatives, including Do You, and if you're not familiar with Do You, I really encourage you to check that out. Leads the graphic design for the coalition, oversees the coalition's online presence, serves as a liaison with press and media, and promotes community education about sexual and intimate partner violence through a racial justice lens. Please join me in welcoming Kate. Thank you, Kate. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Casey. I'm so excited to be here and really happy to be talking about some of the things that we've tried here in Virginia and what we've learned along the way in the process. And I hope that sharing some of our work and our journey will be helpful to folks, but I also acknowledge that learning is reciprocal, and I hope that we have the opportunity to learn from each other involved in racial justice and the sexual violence and intimate partner violence movements during our time together today. So thanks again to Casey specifically and to NRCDV for inviting me to talk about this as part of the DVAM webinar series. As Casey mentioned today, this webinar is for aspiring allies, meaning folks who walk in the world on a daily basis with white skin, who are interested in deepening our understanding of the connections between racial justice work and domestic violence and sexual violence intervention and prevention work. The Action Alliance believes that an intersectional approach is essential to trauma-informed prevention and response. So I'll be talking briefly about the nature of trauma to get us all on the same page. And while intersectionality involves looking at how a wide range of oppressions connect to influence our lives and experiences, we'll be focusing today specifically on one particular type of oppression, which is racism. To that end, we'll look at a few examples of how disparities created by institutional and systemic expressions of racism may affect survivors of color, and I'll offer some concrete examples of how we've integrated racial justice into our work in Virginia. And then we'll wrap up with some ideas for aspiring allies to either get started if this is new work to you, or to dig in deeper if you've been doing this work for a while. And as Casey mentioned, we welcome our colleagues of color on this webinar and hope you will participate as you feel called to do so. And please take care of yourselves as some of this information may be triggering. So the objectives we've already gone over. There's no need to go through that. So Insight, Women, Gender, Nonconforming, and Trans People of Color Against Violence is a national activist organization of radical feminists of color advancing a movement to end violence against women of color through direct action, critical dialogue, and grassroots organizing. In their analysis of how violence against women connects with other forms of oppression, they offer this very clear and succinct thought that survivors of color live at the intersections of racism, sexism, and other oppressions, and that strategies designed to address violence within communities, for example, sexual violence and intimate partner violence, must be linked to strategies that address violence directed against communities of color, for example, state violence, police brutality, racism, etc. So we start at this place at the Action Alliance, and we propose that the work of allies is to understand these intersections and to integrate this understanding into our trauma response. And beyond understanding, to work actively to dismantle these forms of violence at the individual, community, and societal level. Now, looking at how various forms of violence and oppression connect or intersect in a person's life is what we call an intersectional framework. I know a lot of you on the phone have heard of this, this term before. The term intersectionality was coined in 1989 by legal scholar and critical theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who's still active in the movement, in a paper illustrating how black women were often marginalized by both feminist and anti-racist movements because their concerns didn't fit comfortably within either group. The term intersectionality was used to describe how different forms of communication can interact and overlap, and why it was necessary for feminists to take into account the needs of women from a variety of backgrounds when considering social questions and issues to advocate for. That term, intersectionality, and the concept has had deep resonance with groups working toward justice and liberation, and has since been expanded to apply to a wide swath of marginalized and oppressed communities. As Virginia's coalition working to address and prevent sexual and intimate partner violence, we've been doing this work from an intersectional framework for quite some time. More specifically, we've been examining racism and privilege internally as a coalition, staff, and more broadly as a membership organization for more than 15 years. To give you a little bit of context around our work in Virginia, the lion's share of our early intersectional work was carried forward primarily by women of color within and connected to the coalition, such as our Women of Color Caucus, which has been active and leading the forefront on this work since the beginning of the coalition. In 2006, a few coalition staff attended a resource sharing project training on dismantling racism, which really was a catalyst for the coalition to take on dismantling racism work as an entire staff. So I'd like to offer a shout out to Resource Sharing Project, specifically Tracy Wright and Kat Fridley, for being a catalyst in our work in Virginia. Despite working from an intersectional framework for more than 15 years, it wasn't just until just a few years ago that we as the Action Alliance revised our mission statement to reflect a commitment specifically to racial justice. And you'll see this excerpt from our mission statement, which says that understanding the great harm racism has created for individuals, families, and our communities in Virginia, we commit to building within the coalition an anti-racist framework from which to address sexual and domestic violence. So all this is to say that this work is urgent, and at the same time it must be done with the long view. Just like sexual violence work and intimate partner violence work, it is intergenerational. Just a little bit about me, my personal commitment to working on this movement for social change that integrates anti-oppression and specifically a racial justice lens started at the coalition as a staff member and grew through various white allies and multiracial social justice groups, as well as learning as I go as a mom of two really awesome kids and doing my best to teach them about fairness and compassion and equality and justice. So we get to have a lot of really fantastic discussions around the dinner table. I've had many important teachers and mentors along the way, both women of color and aspiring allies. And I want to name them because I think it's important to honor our teachers. They are Kathy Maxfield Coleman, Linda Winston, Christy Van Oudenhoe, Ruth Micklem, and Quillen Musgrave, all with the Action Alliance, or at least formally with the Action Alliance. Kathy Woodson and Ben Thacker Gwaltney with Virginia Organizing, and my parents. So while we at the Action Alliance have been working on examining oppression and privilege in ourselves and in our work for quite a number of years, and we believe we've learned some things along the way, we are not perfect. The work has not been perfect. It's been challenging and messy and frustrating and sometimes honestly painful. It's also been energizing and enlightening and exciting. And the bottom line is that it's essential work. So none of us is an expert at this. And we've learned along the way that the real magic in doing this work successfully is to build relationships, to do our best to stay at the table, and most of all, to be compassionate with one another as we're learning. So oppression, privilege, trauma, all of these are difficult topics to talk about. And when it comes to talking about race specifically, none of us start at a neutral position. By the time we're in elementary school, most of us have already absorbed lots of information about our communities and families' values, and that includes values and assumptions about race and privilege. We're going to try to be calling each other in today instead of focusing on calling out. And we know that relationships are key to being able to do this work and to trust in the power of this work. Coming to this work from a learning stance, we found, is more productive than coming from a kind of a superior or performing stance. And when we do racial justice trainings in Virginia, we spend a lot of time early on in the training talking about the value of compassion and the value of vulnerability in doing this work, because compassion allows us to connect with others, and letting ourselves be vulnerable makes internal change and internal growth more possible. So to start off, just a few assumptions I'll be working with. First of all, an acknowledgement that every one of us on this webinar has what Adrienne Rich calls an intricate politics of location within systems of power, and everyone in the training will have a lifetime of experiences of privilege and oppression from those various systems. So people who live in this country with white skin privilege may experience oppression in other ways. For example, transphobia or ageism or ableism. So we may experience privilege in one aspect of our identity and oppression in another. And certainly the term privilege is a difficult term to accept and apply to ourselves, especially if we've experienced oppression or significant struggles in our lives. For example, poverty or having a disability. And there is no hierarchy of oppressions. Today, however, we are focusing on race oppression and race privilege, and I'll define those terms in just a few minutes. Lastly, we're trained to think about racism as individual acts of meanness versus looking at larger systems and how they operate. So we're going to be working today on trying to focus on thinking systematically and seeing privilege as unearned advantage or exemption from oppression or discrimination. So if you find yourself thinking about your own experiences with individual acts of meanness, I'd ask you to just notice that and have some curiosity around shifting to thinking about larger systems. So before we can uncover how racial justice work is integral to our trauma-informed approaches to addressing and preventing sexual and intimate partner violence, we need to get some clarity on what we mean by trauma. So trauma, as you likely know, is an incident or event that's threatening or perceived as threatening and overwhelms a person's normal coping skills. A person's trauma response is a normal reaction to an abnormal experience, and it can take many forms, and some examples include sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, neglect or abandonment, serious illness, robbery, natural disasters, loss of loved ones, terrorism. For some people, trauma is not a one-time event, but is a threat that builds over time. According to Judith Lewis Herman, who's a psychologist who specializes in trauma, trauma is characterized by feelings of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and threat of annihilation. Historical trauma is another kind of trauma. It's a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. The impact of this type of trauma manifests itself emotionally and physically in members of different cultural groups. As a collective phenomenon, those who never even experienced the traumatic stressor, such as children and descendants, can still exhibit signs and symptoms of historical trauma. Research has demonstrated that trauma can be passed down through DNA and over time impacts life and health outcomes for future generations. Many communities already know this. Folks in Indian country wonder what took this kind of science so long to catch up with traditional Native knowledge. They say in this article that Native healers, medicine people, and elders have always known this, and it's common knowledge in Native oral traditions. And that Native people's ability to maintain culture and sense of who they are in the face of such a traumatic history suggests an inherited resilience that bears scientific examination as well. So examples of historical trauma and how they may manifest themselves. For example, for American Indians or First Nations peoples, one kind of stressor might be the Americanization of Indian boarding schools and the forced assimilation among their students. Violent colonization, general loss, erasure of their cultural traditions. And current manifestations of that kind of historical trauma may be high rates of suicide or domestic violence or alcoholism. For other people of color, thinking about slavery or colonialism, current manifestations may be mistrust of police or an emphasis on self-protection. for immigrants, whether they're forced immigrants or fleeing countries for other reasons because of conflict or natural disasters or famine. Their prevention of cultural and spiritual practices, once they come into this country, may result in a manifestation of fear of loss of culture, of their loss of practices, loss of language, and other traditions. The video clip on the right of the screen called We Shall Remain was created by a group called the Style Horse Collective, which tells stories about tribes, for tribes, as a tribe. And it does a fantastic job of describing the effects of historical trauma in tribal communities. So I encourage you to take a look at that at some point. So the effects of oppression and racism can manifest as trauma intergenerationally. And when individuals come to us for services or call our hotlines, they're coming as whole people who may have been impacted by various adverse experiences throughout the course of their lives and possibly in previous generations. Turning from the effects of historical or intergenerational trauma to the impact of trauma in childhood, I'd like us to talk about the ACEs study. And Casey, at this point, I'm wondering if you could ask folks how many have heard of ACEs?
Thanks, Kate. I'm posing the question right now, so people should see it on their screen. The question is, have you heard of ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Options are yes, no, or I'm not sure. It sounds familiar. See that people are responding. And let me share the results. It looks like about half have heard about it, a quarter not, and 6% not sure.
Great. Thanks so much. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, we've heard here described as the most important study you've never heard of. And to just tell you the story of how it came to be and what its importance is in terms of how we think of trauma here in Virginia. About 20 years ago in San Diego, public health practitioners were puzzled by a constant patient dropout from obesity programs. They decided to investigate whether there were any shared underlying factors among those affected. And they were shocked to find out that those who dropped out almost all had one thing in common, and that commonality was experience of sexual abuse in childhood. This led them to another question. Were there other areas of poor health in adulthood or social outcomes where the people affected had largely been victims of childhood, what they called childhood adversity? We might call it toxic stress or trauma. The result of this investigation was a longitudinal adverse childhood experiences study referred to as the ACEs study. It involved more than 17,000 respondents, mostly middle-aged, middle-class West Coasters in the U.S., through a collaboration of Kaiser Permanente Clinics and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. Each study participant completed a confidential survey that contained questions about their childhood experiences, maltreatment, family dysfunction, as well as items detailing their current health status and behaviors. So this is kind of what they found. It offered a whole life perspective, the results of the study, and revealed a shocking prevalence of 10 classified types of ACEs, which were broken down into 3 areas: abuse, sexual, physical, emotional; neglect, failure to meet basic physical needs, leaving a child uncared for or unloved; and family household dysfunction, witnessing crime, witnessing violence, addiction, crime, parent-to-parent violence, mental illness, etc. So, of course, there are many types of childhood trauma, such as witnessing a sibling being abused, or witnessing violence outside the home, or being bullied by a classmate or teacher. But only 10 types were measured, and those examples were not. So they still provide a useful marker for the severity of trauma experienced in children. Other types of trauma may have a similar impact. So respondents were given an ACE score of 1 to 10. For every adverse experience they said yes to, that resulted in 1 point out of a possible 10 adverse experiences. An overwhelming 2/3 of respondents had experienced at least one ACE, and 12% had an ACE score of 4 or more. 20% had been victims of child sexual abuse. People who identified as women were 50% more likely than people who identified as men to have a score of 5 or more. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's a pediatrician working in San Francisco, learned about the ACE study and completely changed her approach to her medical care and practice as a result. Before learning about the ACE study, she noticed that many of her pediatric patients, children of color, living in neighborhoods with lower economic resources, were showing frequent instances of chronic illness. She came across the ACE study and learned that repeated exposure to toxic stress leads to ongoing, serious, and life-altering problems. Childhood exposure to trauma was strongly and scientifically linked to all kinds of ailments and risky behaviors. For example, heart disease, hepatitis, autoimmune disease, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, depression, and suicide. According to Dr. Burke-Harris, in California, someone who has experienced 7 out of 10 forms of childhood adversity has a 20-year shorter life expectancy than someone who has experienced none. As she says in her TED Talk, the reason for this is the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. And she explains how it works. Imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, you're ready to either fight the bear or run from the bear. And that's wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is that what happens when the bear comes home every night and this system is activated over and over and over again, and it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So the doctor and her staff came up with a screening tool. She realized that if she sees a child who's been exposed to 4 ACEs, she knows their lifetime risk of heart disease is double, that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 2.5 times the risk, depression, 4.5, suicide, 12 times. So they use a screening tool as a survey that asks parents how many adverse experiences their child has gone through. Parents don't have to identify which experiences they are in an attempt to encourage honest responses. But the more boxes they check, the higher a child's score. Young children with high scores are invited to participate in psychotherapy with their parents. As they grow older, they work with therapists to recognize signs of their body's fight or flight response and to calm down with breathing exercises or other strategies. What Dr. Burke-Harris has done is an example of trauma-informed care. So at this point, Casey, I'd like to ask folks kind of a pulse check. Since there's been so much emphasis on trauma-informed advocacy in the last few years, can we hear about how much you may have changed your approach because of what we call this new trauma lens? So the question we could pose is, to what extent has learning about trauma-informed advocacy changed the way in which you do your work? Not at all, somewhat, moderate amount, very much.
Thanks, Kate. Responses are coming in now, and I'll be sharing in just a moment. So Kate, you should be able to see the breakdown of people's responses to the question. It looks like 32% say very much. 15, 16% are saying somewhat or a moderate amount.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Casey. So it looks like none of us have taken this new information and done nothing with it, that there has been a change in our work from some to a complete overhaul of how we approach the problem. And so it's important to think about how we define the problem determines how we work on the problem. Thinking back to Dr. Burke-Harris, prior to learning about ACEs, she saw this disturbing trend of a lot of kids being referred to her for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when she went through and did a thorough history and physical, she found out that most of her patients didn't really fit with a diagnosis of ADHD, that she was seeing that they had experienced severe trauma and felt like something else was going on. She actually has a master's degree in public health from, I think, Harvard. And one of the things that she learned in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what is going on with this well? So she began reading everything that she could get her hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. So when she no longer looked at the source of the problem as attention disorders, but instead started to see the attention problems as a symptom of or reaction to a deeper problem like trauma, her entire practice changed, much like how you guys on the webinar have changed your practices. So how we define the problem determines how we respond to and work on the problem. Many of us who've been working to address and prevent intimate partner violence and sexual violence see these problems as symptoms of a larger systemic problem. For example, patriarchy might be one of the theories that drives our work. A culture and system that supports and values maleness over femaleness, and whatever those cultural attributes are assigned to those two categories. Another way to look at interconnectedness or intersections is this, that violence is an expression of and a tool to maintain oppression. It kind of goes both ways. For example, looking at racism and white supremacy. And when I talk about white supremacy, it's the notion that whiteness has more value than non-whiteness, which is part of living in a culture that values whiteness. So violence supports racism. Sexual violence has been used historically as a tool for colonization, a tool to maintain white supremacy. And in return, racism supports violence. People of color may be less likely to seek help for fear of unjust treatment or deportation or further punishment. Layers of oppression make some people more vulnerable to violence. All oppressions are perpetuated by a power over dynamic rather than a shared power. And when we're talking about power over, it really looks very similar, whether we're talking about an intimate relationship, a one-on-one relationship, or violence or oppression that's being committed against larger groups, collective, societal level power. So, for example, using physical or sexual violence, economic abuse, using children. On an individual level, using children looks like making survivors feel guilty about children, denying custody or access to children, or threatening to do that if the survivor leaves, threatening to tell authorities that survivor is LGBT, so they'll remove children from the home. On a collective level, using children looks like forced removal of children from communities through the foster care system or deportation, forced sterilization, restricted access to reproductive health services for poor communities and communities of color, and disparate racial disproportionalities in CPS investigations. Going down the line, psychological abuse, isolation, looking at intimidation, coercion, and threats. On an individual level, it looks like making a survivor afraid by using looks, gestures, actions, smashing things, abusing pets, displaying weapons, threatening to destroy property, etc., etc. On a collective level, intimidation, coercion, and threats looks like creating a culture of fear and unpredictability through cultural messages which condone harassment or violence towards certain social groups, leveraging access to authority like law enforcement, child protective services, immigration, or just general surveillance of the community. I want to give credit to the Northwest Network for the content of this slide. We redesigned it to fit with our materials, but the content of it we found really helpful in talking about this. So I know a lot of folks have heard of the social ecological model. This is what we call the expanded SEM that we found through the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment. And it illustrates the connection of trauma-informed advocacy to our work. So if we think about doing our work on multiple levels of the SEM, we're not only changing individual knowledge, attitudes, and skills, but also changing things on a relationship level, organizational or community norms and policies. So the model illustrates how trauma is not just individual-based, but it crosses the whole SEM. In addition, it shows this outer layer called period of time and history that helps us connect historical trauma, such as racism or sexism, to our prevention, intervention, and advocacy work. So let me give you an example about period of time and history on this SEM. Right now, in 2015, we are seeing numerous incidents in the media of people of color experiencing police brutality. These incidences likely impact how people of color who are seeing this violence, how they view the police. And if you are a survivor of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, and you're a person of color, your view of police as safe or supportive will likely be impacted. So at the Action Alliance, we see addressing police brutality and use of force as part of our work. Because when you have whole communities of survivors not feeling able to access the criminal legal system, part of our advocacy is addressing this injustice. And that may be through prevention initiatives, training initiatives, policy initiatives, and so on. So we're talking about both historical and current events that can result in trauma. In order to dig into why this matters today, let's spend a little bit of time looking at some terms and digging a little deeper. So sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but I wanted to kind of clarify how we define these terms here at the Action Alliance when we're talking about this work. So for prejudice, we define it as an attitude based on limited information, often on stereotypes. Prejudice is usually, but not always, negative. However, positive and negative prejudices alike are damaging in that they deny the individuality of the person. And it's important to note that none of us is free of prejudice, that we all have preconceived notions of lots of people. And those prejudices have the negative impact of denying folks' individuality. When we're talking about racial justice, we are not talking about reducing prejudice or prejudice reduction. If we just focused on prejudice reduction, we would teach people how to get along better, but we would never get at the systemic forces at work that cause people to to have different access to safety and justice in this country based on the color of their skin. So for power, we consider that the ability to influence. There are different kinds of power, certainly. There's individual, collective, and societal power. And in this definition, we're thinking beyond individual power, but more like systemic power, the ability to influence whole institutions. So oppression is a combination of the top two terms. Oppression is prejudice plus power, the ability to influence. Racism is a subcategory of oppression. It's a type of oppression. And that is power plus race prejudice, a specific type of prejudice. And it's different from racial prejudice or discrimination because it involves one group having the power to carry out systemic discrimination through the major institutions of society. Privilege is the other side of racism that we often neglect to talk about. And we define it as unearned advantages. So when we're talking about race privilege and white skin privilege, it means not being judged or treated negatively by people in power because of one's skin color. It also means benefiting from living in a country in which major institutions of society are created and operated by people who also have white skin, including financial, educational, criminal, legal, and media institutions. So racism is race prejudice plus power. And again, and it is also a system of advantage and a system of oppression. And while we're trained to think about racism in terms of individual racist acts, for example, someone using a racial slur, we're focusing today on how racism is expressed and carried out in larger systems and how those larger systems collectively impact entire communities. So here's a graphic that hopefully explains that a little bit more when we're talking about systemic racism. They're generally understood to be three kinds of expressions of racism: individual, institutional, and cultural. Systemic racism is looking at the larger, kind of more invisible in some ways, institutional and cultural expressions. Systemic racism occurs when the way a society is structured systematically ends up giving advantages to some and disadvantages to others based on race. Systemic racism is what keeps survivors of color trapped and not able to gain access to safety and healing. So I'm going to give you a few examples of institutional disparities that are rooted in racist policies and practices to kind of take this from the theory down to kind of practical application. And starting with disparities on how wealth is accumulated, which is a metaphor for access to resources. So median household income is one measure of a given demographic's economic well-being. Wealth is different. It's a measure of all the money a family has as well as assets, such as a house. And it's often accumulated and passed down from one generation to the next. The Urban Institute notes that the racial wealth gap is 3 times greater than the racial income gap. So in 1983, looking at the change, for every dollar held by the average Black or Latino family, the average white family had 5. Rather than shrinking, that gap has increased from the 1980s through today, and white families now have nearly 6 times as much wealth as Black families. Where does that disparity come from? It comes from home values in white neighborhoods versus neighborhoods where people of color live, and that's rooted at least as far back as the 1934 National Housing Act, which redlined Black neighborhoods, marking them as credit risks. Now, redlining was outlawed in the 60s, but the effects of redlining that was outlawed 40 years ago, 50 years ago, persists today in the form of neighborhoods consisting mostly of people of color that have high poverty rates, low home values. And while redlining is a thing of the past, discriminatory lending still exists today. Mortgages obtained by households of color tend to have higher interest rates, all other things being equal. Even as recently as 2012, Wells Fargo, huge banking institution, admitted that it had steered Black and Latino households into subprime mortgages, but it offered white borrowers with similar credit profiles prime mortgages. So this chart shows how Latinos and African Americans with good credit receive high interest rate mortgages far more often than whites. These mortgages are supposed to go to risky borrowers. Because of their higher rates, houses purchased with these mortgages are harder to pay off and are more likely to be foreclosed on. This phenomenon, giving higher rate or subprime mortgages to families of color who qualified for the more traditional mortgages, was one of the reasons why the housing bubble burst, which in turn helped trigger the global financial crisis. This phenomenon also explains why people of color were hit harder by the Great Recession and illuminates the modern-day racism that keeps the wealth gap so strikingly high. Looking at disparities and applications of policies and laws. So a myriad criminal justice policies that appear to be race-neutral collide with broader socioeconomic patterns to create a disparate racial impact. Policing policies and sentencing laws are two key sources of racial inequality. Police policies that cast a wide net in neighborhoods and on populations associated with high crime rates disproportionately affect people of color. Consequently, people of color are more likely to be arrested for the same behavior that whites may engage in but not get arrested for. This greater level of scrutiny also contributes to higher rates of recidivism among people of color. Almost 1 in 3 people arrested for drug law violations is Black, although drug use rates really don't differ much by race and ethnicity. An ACLU report found that African Americans are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites in 2010. This disparity expands at later stages of the criminal legal system, so that 57% of people in state prisons for drug offenses are people of color, even though whites comprise over 2/3 of drug users and are likely a similar proportion of sellers. So a completely different effect for the same kind of behavior. Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's an author and journalist at The Atlantic, talks about how the criminal legal system works. And he says, quote, "Our system is working the way it's intended. If you believe prison is a solution to dealing with the myriad social needs of the African American community, we see problems like mental health and drug dependence as things that should be criminalized. Viewed from another lens, these are public health problems. Are we really okay with a 1 in 3 chance for every African American male born in this generation eventually doing some time in prison or jail? Are we okay with people of color holding the position that they do in our society? Or do we have instead some long-term commitment to justice?" These disparities are also played out in how the media tell the stories of perpetrators of violence and victims of violence. The stories are often told differently depending on the race or ethnicity of the victim or perpetrator. Racist cultural narratives teach us over and over again the myth that white people are generally responsible and believable, and if they do something bad, it's out of character, while people of color are generally suspect or dangerous, and if they do something bad, it's a reflection of the diminished moral values of an entire community. You can see here how the theater shooting suspect, this person who went into a theater and shot and killed many people, was the headline that he was a brilliant science student. And below, Michael Brown, who was a kid just graduated from high school, was going off to college, and was shot dead by a police officer. The headline is that he was struggled with a police officer before the shooting. Huffington Post did a really brilliant comparison of how the media treats white suspects of generally multiple homicides and killers better than black victims of police violence. For example, Trayvon Martin, the headline was he was suspended 3 times from school. A white suspect of an Oregon high school shooting says that he was fascinated with guns but was a devoted Mormon. This father of 2 was unarmed and killed by a police officer while entering his own vehicle that contained his own children. But the headline was, "A deputy killed this man out of fear for children's safety." A white suspect of a mass shooting in Santa Barbara, the headline was that he was a soft-spoken, polite gentleman. Looking back at the unequal application of what are ostensibly race-neutral policies that still result in unequal treatment throughout the criminal legal system, Marissa Alexander is a prime case for this. She's a Florida mother whose case became a rallying cry for anti-racism activists and survivors of domestic violence when she was released in January of this year after 3 years of being incarcerated. She faced up to 60 years behind bars for firing a single shot near her abusive husband because he had threatened to kill her, and she was just a week out from giving birth to a baby who was still in intensive care in the NICU. He had threatened to kill her. Her other children were in the house. She stood her ground and fired a warning shot to protect her life and the life of her kids. She pleaded guilty to assault in exchange for credit for time served and released subject to 2 years of electronic monitoring. So this incident in question took place in 2010. Her estranged husband, Rico Gray, had physically abused her several times, and on that day he threatened to kill her. No one was injured, but the jury convicted her in about 12 minutes and sentenced her for this crime. So her case sparked outrage about the unequal application of the law for both African Americans and women. She was prosecuted by Angela Corey, who was also the prosecutor in the trial of George Zimmerman, who was acquitted in the February 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin. You can visit freemarissanow.org for more information and to identify ways for how you can get involved in the struggle to free her completely. She is still on electric monitoring and house arrest. I see Quillen is putting resources into the chat box, so thank you so much for doing that, Quillen. The Human Rights Project for Girls, along with the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality and the Ms. Foundation for Women, released just a few months ago this incredible report called The Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, The Girl Story. And it exposes how girls, specifically girls of color, are arrested and incarcerated as a result of sexual abuse. In the last 2 decades, detentions of girls in the juvenile justice system have increased 40%. 45% of justice-involved girls have experienced 5 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So the juvenile justice system is not only failing to address, but exacerbating trauma that caused the girls to be there in the first place. And this is how the kind of circle works that this diagram is illustrating. Schools fail to support girls who are victims of gender-based violence or harassment on campus. The girls no longer feel safe and as a result may disengage or become truant or exhibit challenging behaviors that are rooted in a trauma response. Yet instead of being viewed as victims of sexual violence, these girls are instead disciplined often, including being suspended, expelled, or referred to law enforcement. Girls of color are particularly affected by this trend. Although rates of overrepresentation vary significantly depending on the jurisdiction you're looking at, the national trends indicate that African American girls constitute 14% of the general population nationally, but are 33% of girls detained and committed. Native American girls are also disproportionately involved in the juvenile justice system. They are 1% of the general youth population, but 3% of detained and committed girls. So the sexual abuse to prison pipeline is a result of the absence of a trauma-informed response in conjunction with unequal application of ostensibly race-neutral policies. Another example that's related closely to our work. The National Domestic Violence Hotline just released a survey of a report of a survey that they did this year in April 2015 about law enforcement responses to partner abuse with survivors who used the hotline's chat services. Overall, they surveyed 637 women with experiences of partner abuse who agreed to participate in the survey. Participants were an average of 30 years old and 56% white, 15% Hispanic or Latino, and 11% African American. Because some of the survey was conducted on the chat line, results include both quantitative information and qualitative information, non-personally identifying quotes. About half of the survey respondents had not yet interacted with the police about their partner abuse experiences, and about half had. Both the women who had called the police and the women who hadn't called the police shared a strong reluctance to turning to law enforcement for help. They said that calling the police might make things worse. They were afraid that the police wouldn't believe them. Of the participants who actually had contacted the police, 2 in 5, or 43%, felt the police had discriminated against them for various reasons. And that includes because they didn't represent what they call the, quote, perfect victim, and being discriminated against because of race, ethnicity, or immigration status. So having looked at some examples of disparities in treatment and results for communities of color in a few different institutions, Casey, I'm wondering if we could ask this question in the chat box. What are the ways that systemic racism might create barriers for survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence? And you can just respond in the chat box.
Thanks, Kate. Yes, please go ahead and text or chat your responses in the public chat here. And we'll see if we can read them aloud as they come through. So fear of law enforcement. We're looking for ways that systemic racism creates barriers for survivors. And certainly fear of law enforcement would be a major way when we're constantly telling people to call the police. Reluctance to go to hospitals and medical centers for help, resistance to report your perpetrator, no ethnic or racial representation in helping agencies, lack of education, fear of anxiety about reaching out to anyone for help, judicial system, fear of being arrested, immigration status, systems less likely to believe or support survivors of color, lack of access to various systems, especially around finances, education, employment, TANF, fear of reporting to service agencies due to stigma, perhaps lack of individuals of some racial identities within those organizations. Women of color, particularly black women, are viewed as hypersexualized and thus less believed to experience sexual assault. We are also noting language barriers, lack of assistance in court. When the state or police are perpetrators of violence themselves, survivors may not seek to get justice through that criminal justice system. There's a fear of being accused of false reporting. Language barriers, including terminology in the medical field, not having access to services such as housing, health care, therapy, lawyers, perhaps a higher incidence of drug abuse or alcohol, fear that children will be removed, judgmental responses from child protective services, judges, or providers. Somebody notes males in interracial marriages are fearful of law enforcement and not always believed. Not defining one's experience as an assault because of past racist responses. Fear of losing children, or children losing their fathers just like they lost their fathers. Fear because you may have a criminal record. I think that's what's come through so far, Kate.
Yeah. Well, so I'm seeing, I think, all of you are reporting that there's a wide variety of ways in which survivors of color may have different experiences with what are traditionally considered helping institutions that survivors who are white may not. So thank you for all of those fantastic responses. So once you know some things, you can't unknow them. It's a burden that can never be given away. This is something we talk about in our racial justice trainings, that basically having this information in some way, seeing how systems work differently for different groups of people, you can't pretend that those differences exist. They don't exist. And how we move through the world has to change, knowing this, and how we conduct our work has to change, knowing this. And so we have been, over the last few years and talking about this, trying to evolve our work in a way that takes into account these differential experiences and tries to undo some of the differential experiences. So we think about, in the Action Alliance, conducting our work through 3 connected lenses. And now I'm going to start talking about kind of how we've changed our work in Virginia. So we look at it through a racial justice or anti-oppression lens, a trauma-informed advocacy lens, and an asset-building lens. And when we put these lenses on, we discovered that all of our work got better and stronger and more effective. So, for example, our prevention and advocacy work is informed by our racial justice work, and vice versa. Our trauma-informed advocacy is informed by our prevention work, and vice versa. Our racial justice work is informed by our trauma-informed advocacy, and so on and so forth. So here are some specific examples of how we at the Action Alliance have integrated a racial justice lens into the various aspects of our work. Organizationally, internally, we've made quite a few changes over the years around how we select our staff, how we orient our staff, how we train our staff, and how we keep our staff engaged in discussions around oppression, racial justice, and privilege. So that starts with our job ads, with identifying that we have a commitment to racial justice and addressing and doing this work through a racial justice lens, asking interview questions to to potential candidates on staff about how they see how racial justice work connects with this work. Our staff orientation includes having brand new staff get this book, Enhancing Safety and Justice. It's kind of a manual that we've assembled over the years. They get this the first week that they are there on staff, and they're expected to review it and talk about it and kind of process it with a one-on-one staff mentor for the first few months of their being on staff. This particular workbook has been a long-term collaborative effort between the Women of Color Caucus here as our membership at the Action Alliance, the Racial Justice Task Force, and before that a few iterations of some white ally groups and Action Alliance staff. And we consider it a work in perpetual progress. I don't know if it's ever going to be done. We're always kind of adding to it and revising it, depending on what we've learned about the work. We also, go ahead.
Kate, I wonder if I can stop you. So Jane and her group there is having a side discussion where they're wanting to know if you can give some examples of the cultural racism that you described in one of the previous slides. So she says, for example, how is music used culturally to oppress? So can you expand on that a little bit?
That's a really good question. So when we're talking about cultural racism, and this comes through in music as well, it's about promoting values. What is valued in our culture? So maybe external beauty might be valued, and there's a particular kind of external beauty that might be valued in our culture that tends to be related to folks who have white skin privilege, for example, having a particular body type or hair type or skin color. So that's one example of how cultural racism is expressed through any kind of the arts, through music, through spoken art, through poetry, through paintings, and so on.
Thanks so much, Kate. And a lot of people are wondering about, I see Quillen responding here, about the resource that you have up on the screen now and how they can get a copy of that resource.
Yes. Yeah, we would like to make it more available widely to folks, and so we need to figure out how to do that. But yes, we are definitely open to sharing it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So internally, we also have ongoing education and discussion groups with staff talking specifically about not only kind of outwardly systemic problems, but inwardly how internalized privilege or internalized oppression operates in ourselves as individual people. This is one example of another piece of information that's in that workbook that we were just talking about that we have used in providing technical assistance to our domestic violence programs. We call it the Perpetuating Racism Wheel and Dismantling Racism Wheel. It probably looks really familiar to some folks. It was created by the Women of Color Caucus and Social Justice Task Force quite a few years ago. And so just to give you an example of one thing that you might see on the Perpetuating Racism Wheel is minimizing, denying, and blaming. For example, saying, I don't see color, racism is over, we treat everyone the same, they, whoever they means, just wanting special rights. And under the Dismantling Racism Wheel, kind of the counterweight to that is shared responsibility, speaking up about racism, recognizing that working to address racism lies in the hands of all of us. So those are what we call the Dismantling Racism Wheels, and they are they're part of the workbook. We also try to tie our racial justice lens into our communications. We have just developed a set of core messages that help us guide how we talk about our work, specifically around press and media. And two of the core messages have to do with intersectionality, and they are that privilege and oppression often shape access to help and safety, and that we strive to do our work through a racial justice lens. We include our racial justice lens and commitment in our website, in our social media, which I'll talk about in a minute, and in our public policy. Just to give you an example, increasingly it seems there's a trend for kind of mainstream anti-violence advocates to demand longer prison sentences for batterers or sex offenders. as a frontline approach to stopping violence against women. But we, through the racial justice lens, we see the criminal legal system as being really oppressive toward communities of color. And so when we see a proposal in Virginia or federally that's around policy of enhancing penalties, we take a long, hard look at it, and generally we have kind of an internal policy toward opposing those because they have been used and leveraged against communities of color in the past so much more harshly than against white folks. And so we see that as an example of disparate impact and try to reduce that disparate impact by generally not supporting enhanced penalties. Of course, it requires discussion. We don't have kind of a blanket reaction to it. In our social media, we try to connect examples of oppression in kind of what's in the public consciousness with how survivors of color might be seeing it. So you may recall this summer Sandra Bland, who was a 28-year-old African-American woman, was found dead in a Waller County jail in Texas 3 days after being arrested during a traffic stop. And the dash cam video of her traffic stop is extremely disturbing. And we hear the sounds of violence, but that particular traffic cam stop doesn't really show it, but we've seen other videos of it. So we posted that we're sad to hear about this, we're disturbed by it, and that because we have a commitment to engage in sexual and domestic violence work through a racial justice lens, we want you to think about shifting your focus from thinking about Mrs. Bland's actions, because at that point Sandra Bland was being heavily criticized by her reaction to the officer, and so we asked folks to turn their attention to where the professional responsibility lies, and that was the person in the situation holding the power, authority, and professional training, the deputy. And you'll see, I don't know if you can see it in this red box, but even though this particular case was not specifically about sexual violence or intimate partner violence, we tried to relate it to the experiences of survivors of color, saying, as you view the video and follow the investigation as a possible homicide, please think about how this trooper's behavior may impact people of color who are survivors of trauma and violence and who are thinking about calling the police for help. We also try to integrate our racial justice lens philosophy into our trainings. Here's a few examples of newsprint from a recent training we did around racial justice as a trauma-informed lens. In our campus work, our posters, we did a lot of work trying to reflect diversity of models and testing the posters, the content, and the visuals specifically with students of color, specifically on historically black colleges and universities. Our Do You prevention work focuses on investigating and working to address root causes of violence. So because we believe sexism is a root cause of sexual violence and intimate partner violence, part of our prevention work is promoting gender equality. And we believe that our culture continues to promote and perpetuate racism, which then impacts access to equality, safety, justice, and resources. So part of our prevention work is about promoting racial justice. We developed the Do You program and tested it with African American youth because the last thing we want to do is create a program that isn't culturally relevant to a community that in Virginia is disproportionately experiencing the most lethal violence in Virginia. The content of Do You includes having teens think about privilege, oppression, and marginalization in terms that they can understand. Our advocacy and hotline work tries to represent communities of color nationally. Deadly violence against LGBTQ communities disproportionately impacts people of color. So we try to represent folks of color in our LGBTQ helpline posters. Over half nationally of homicide victims of LGBTQ communities were transgender women, and half of those were transgender women of color, yet transgender survivors and victims only represent 19% of the total reports to the National Coalition on Anti-Violence Programs. So it's a very high community that's being targeted for lethal violence. So we wanted to represent them in our helpline posters. In Virginia, African American and Black women are victims of family and intimate partner violence at a rate almost 3 times as high than for white women. So we know this is a result of disparities in access to community resources, justice, and safety, and the disparities in access are a result of racism. So we developed the I Deserve campaign, which focuses on flipping a prevailing cultural narrative that blames women for their own victimization, and instead lifts up young women who are Black or African American as worthy of respect, protection, and safety. So looking at individual work, I really like this slide because A, it says directory on the top, and B, it has a Dalai Lama on it, which I think is kind of awesome. But it really exemplifies how racial justice is about not just intention, but about action and impact. So these next few slides are items that are also in our workbook, and I'll go through them pretty quickly. But this is about how allies can step into the work and stay on it. And it's talking about being present for the struggle and staying at the table and noticing and naming systems of privilege and oppression. And when you need support and when you need to talk through things or learn from things, try to seek support first from aspiring allies and avoid relying on people of color to comfort you or alleviate feelings of guilt. Those feelings are really, really common when we are doing the work. But discomfort and feelings of guilt need to be processed with other aspiring allies instead of seeking that from people of color. And sit with and embrace discomfort because that's a really valuable exercise in kind of learning from where that's coming from. This is a poster that our Women of Color Caucus and Social Justice Task Force developed a few years ago around privilege, and it's about looking at doing your own work, looking at how privilege has shaped your own experiences. And it doesn't mean that you haven't had struggles, but it does mean examining how you and your ancestors have benefited from opportunities that may have been solely available to people with white skin. Acting as an ally means taking risks. It means being uncomfortable. It means sometimes making mistakes. But every day people of color are taking risks and living their lives with dignity and safety. And so what we need to do to honor that is to kind of take the leap and know that mistakes we learn from and just keep showing up. It also means ally work is about doing what you can to interrupt oppressive systems. And one of the things that we can do is to help spread counter-narratives. This is an example of a brilliant counter-narrative that was launched on social media last August 2014 after 18-year-old Mike Brown was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. The hashtag #IfTheyGunMeDown trended in reaction to the media's portrayal of Mike Brown and lots of other victims. And African American folks asked, if I was killed by police, how would I be portrayed? And it shows how a racist and victim-blaming cultural narrative is central to how the media responds to the victimization of a community that's vulnerable. This person in these two pictures is the same guy. One, he's giving, looks like a commencement speech and making Bill Clinton crack up behind him because it's hilarious and brilliant. And below, he's just messing around in his apartment. So if they gun me down, how would the media portray him? Which picture would they use? Another example, same person, one reading to kids in uniform, and another one just kind of relaxing on his bed. One more example. The hashtag Say Her Name is related to this. It's about lifting up the experiences of women of color, specifically African American and Black women, whose stories about being victims of police or state violence are getting lost sometimes in the movement. And so Say Her Name is one way that you can promote a counter-narrative. Keep learning from other allies. Showing Up for Racial Justice, also called SURGE, its acronym, offers fantastic resources and actions, police accountability, all kinds of wonderful things. So they are available at showingupforracialjustice.org. Race Forward is led by communities of color doing the work. They advance racial justice through research, media, and practice. They've been around a long time. They had another name that I can't remember because it was kind of long. But anyway, it offers fantastic systemic analysis and a really innovative approach, and a huge multiracial conference every year called Facing Race. They are incredible. They have an incredible blog, a great website, so check them out. Racial Equity Tools is really a fantastic way to keep on top of the most current research and resources. They have tools, tips, curricula, and ideas for people who want to increase their own understanding of how racial justice contributes to our work. Consider how racial justice is part of doing trauma-informed work. When we think of the key elements of a trauma-informed response being safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, empowerment, take a while to think about and talk to your colleagues about how might these elements look different when you consider them from a racial justice lens. Remember, the goal trauma-informed work, or the vision, is being able to provide services so that people can bring their whole authentic selves to this work. And we need to listen to people of color who tell us where they need us to put our efforts. So this is a quote from Alicia Garza, who's one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter, as you probably know, was started by two queer women of color and a daughter of Nigerian immigrants. And she says, we need you defecting from white supremacy and changing the narrative of white supremacy by breaking white silence. So it's one of the effects of white privilege is white supremacy, and telling us over and over again that our ideas, our values, even our very lives carry more worth than people of color. That's white supremacy. And so part of our work is naming it and calling it out. And being the work is really important. Practicing a compassion and accountability for ourselves and others is really, really critical. So staying focused on the big picture, it's much bigger than one action. As I said, it's intergenerational work. And it can start anywhere at home. It can start anywhere, like at home, at work, with kids, families, in the streets. Focus on bringing people in rather than putting them down. And focus on building relationships. We like to use a quote from vulnerability researcher Brene Brown in this work. It's kind of helpful for us to keep moving on. And this helps us remember that this work requires humility and listening, and also being vulnerable to the possibility that we might mess up, that we might get it wrong, that we might not do enough. But if we allow ourselves to go there, it can be a birthplace for innovation, creativity, change, and even liberation. And finally, I want to leave with a quote that one of my mentors, Kathy Maxfield Coleman, says at the end of every of our racial justice trainings, that it's a quote from Maya Angelou, who's a poet, author, civil rights activist, and survivor of violence. And she says simply, when you know better, you do better. And I wanted to thank everybody for hanging in there and being part of this work.
Thank you so much, Kate. We are all just so energized from this discussion, so grateful for all of the amazing resources that you've shared. And I can tell that everybody on this webinar is just wanting more. So I can tell you that we will be sending a follow-up email after this webinar where you'll get a recording and links to all of the amazing resources, and probably a Storify summary of the discussion that's happening over on Twitter. So we promise to send you all kinds of things, and let's keep the conversation going. We will be continuing this conversation next week for the final webinar in our DVAM 2015 series. On that session, we'll hear from our friends at Women of Color Network, the Reverend Dr. Elise Moore-Orby, Lisa Huarbe-Botella, and Zoe Flowers, who will discuss the necessity for intersectionality in our work as we seek our collective liberation. So let's be sure to talk then, and you can keep the conversation going under #allies on Twitter. Kate, we are just so grateful for everything that you've brought to us, and really excited to have a partnership with you at the Virginia Action Alliance. So do you have any closing words or thoughts before we close out today's session?
I just wanted to thank everybody for hanging in there, and if we can create a larger community of folks doing this work, that would help keep us all in it in the long run.
Thank you so much, Kate.